I'm Jane McAlevey, and I am an organizer. I mean, fundamentally, like if you look across, I've worked in the environmental justice movement for many years, and I made a transition into the labor movement, basically right on the heels of the President Sweeney election. At the AFL-CIO in 1995, when we had the first contested election, really in the history of the merged institutions, there's a lot of promise in the labor movement, and people like me, I think, signed up in droves.
You wrote a piece, June 26th issue of The Nation magazine with Bill Fletcher, about the lessons from Wisconsin. Talk about hopes and disappointments. The top lessons in your view, what were they?
I think the top lesson in our view is that there's not enough internal radical political education taking place inside of America's unions. If there was one thing that we have to do differently, it's actually trust that our rank and file can handle a lot of information, and that the rank and file of the unions will know what to do with, like real facts, real information, what's really happening. And participatory radical education, sort of Freirean style. You know, one thing I should back up and say in terms of the introduction is I worked at a place called the Highlander Center for many years when I was very young. And I'm quite sure that my bias as an organizer towards intense levels of education for the rank and file comes from being in my mid-20s and working at the most prestigious adult education center in this country. You know, that was the heart of the civil rights movement, and et cetera. So, and that Highlander Center was also, which most people don't even know, it was the CIO's official labor education school in the 30s and 40s. So with that background to my early years of work, by the time I hit the labor movement, I had a very strong philosophy that I trusted the workers. If you trust the workers and you actually present a framework that they can begin to understand, this isn't just the boss on the third shift, by the way, it's the corporation you're working for. And then if you can help them go from the corporation they're working for, from the boss on the third shift, you can connect up the dots to there's this larger system of oppression that's taking place in this country, dressed up as free enterprise. I was trained by someone named Jerry Brown, who is now retired, formerly head of 1199 New England, which was a communist-based union that continued, even though they broke with Stalin, et cetera, they continued the organizing tradition that came out of the Communist Party in the 30s, which is deep organizing. It starts with trusting the workers. So when I became a union organizer, and I'd been organizing already, I became a union organizer, okay, what do I need to know? Organizing to me is the same wherever you're doing it, but there are rules you have to learn. There's different ways the rules operate. So Jerry Brown, who I credit enormously for a lot of brilliant labor work in his time, said to me, trust the workers, McAlevey, treat them like grown-ups, and run the union.
But still, going back to the June election in Wisconsin, 1/3 of all union members voted for Scott Walker.
That's right.
The anti-union governor to stay in office.
Yeah, but I think that's symbolic of what happens when you don't trust the workers. You don't actually help them understand that this guy, this Republican guy, Scott Walker, they could be Republicans. Let's say 1/3 of them are. In fact, I've seen some arguments in Wisconsin where people said, well, 1/3 of union members will Republican, 1/3 will always vote Republican, and I think that's a bad analysis. The question is, what's the relationship between the leadership of the union and the rank and file members? And the 38% that voted for Scott Walker come from, it's reflective of a lack of real, consistent, ongoing relationship building with the rank and file of the union. And when we don't engage the workers and treat them like grown-ups and say, we have to have actually some really hard conversations. Things are looking really bad right now. And here's why, and then explain how Scott Walker connects to what's happening to the second shift manager or whatever it is. If we don't do that, we're going to continue to have 38% of union members voting against their self-interest, even though I think Bill Fletcher and I say in that piece, in our own experience, we've both done a ton of radical political education with thousands and thousands of workers. When we do our work right as labor leaders, when we really share what's really happening to these workers around them, give them the space to learn it on their own, to explore the system called capitalism in a way that's not coming in with some doctrinaire, right? I think that you would find that they're not going to vote against their self-interest. We're not helping people connect the dots.
Now, the dots in Wisconsin, when I was out there covering the uprising of a year ago, were pretty broadly laid out. We interviewed grassroots activists from the world of agriculture, from the education field, teaching aides, young people of color fighting against cuts in social services and more. It's not just about workers.
Yeah.
What has happened since when it comes to capitalizing, for lack of a better word, on all those dots, that we're not just in the quote-unquote workplace.
Yeah, I think that that's right. Although I was in the piece, we were focused on the 38% of unions that did, right? But there's a broader sort of breakdown in this country that's been a 50, 60, 70-year campaign to sort of destroy the reputation of unions. We don't have a labor page, we have a business page, every newspaper, right? We don't have so we get a one-way view from the American capitalist press every day. And it drums into people these horrible lessons. It brings up horrible lessons from some union that defended. So there is a total lack of understanding of what the real purpose of a union in this country is and what it does. But unless and until labor leaders are willing to take some responsibility for rebuilding the relationship internally to the rank and file, and then I think this is where the dot connects everyone else you're talking about interviewing. It's through our rank and file in the labor movement that the relationship to sort of external allies needs to be built. It's not a professional staff operation. And I think part of what has happened in the union movement, and it's not just unions, it's in our movement, whether it's the feminist movement, whether it's the environmental movement and the labor movement. I don't like to just blame labor here as an organizer, since I organized in all these movements. The same tendency has been taking place from the time I think that Alinsky published Rules for Radicals in 1972. There has been a fairly fast transition away from the deep organizing that characterizes American left movements, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And in the 70s, we take a turn from what we would call deep organizing into what I call shallow mobilizing, where you replace leadership engagement, radical rank and file education, and I mean rank and file, whether it's conservation, environmental, women, et cetera, right? The rank and file, meaning the grassroots, the people, ordinary Americans. We've replaced doing real leadership development and really empowering people and really trusting that they can figure out what's wrong with this country if we give them the tools to, with communications, messaging, pollsters, lawyers, lawsuits, and a bunch of staff and a bunch of advocacy organizations who sort of do the work for people. And all you're left to do is go turn out people for a rally. And our movements become go turn out bodies for a rally. And that's why 38% of union members voted for Walker.
Why did it happen? Why did it happen in the 70s? You have a book soon coming out in the fall from Verso that will go into this in more depth. But to give us a taste right now, what happened in the 70s to make the shift?
And I think that this, so we had tremendous success in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that success came from brutally hard work, right? I mean, people were shot, killed, et cetera. And I think that people sort of like, we got the height of power. The environmental movement passed all of its biggest legislation in 71 under Nixon, right? Mm-hmm. Clean air. The labor movement, we had won Medicaid, we had won the Civil Rights Act, we had won the National Labor Relations Act. I mean, we won a series of structurally very powerful changes that happened from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, culminating in the early 1970s. And so on the part of the movement, I think people thought, we've won. We now need to set up very highly bureaucratized, professionalized organizations in Washington, D.C., hire a bunch of lawyers to implement our laws. By the way, most of those laws have never been implemented because there was a failure to understand that the reason that we passed the laws was because from 1930, and we could go way back in history, but in summary, really, from the 1930s through the late 1950s, there was extraordinary movement in this country. Out, grassroots, everywhere. Every movement understood that the odds were so stiff against them, we had to build to majorities in the field to win. So they did incredible work, sacrificed so much, built huge majorities, built movements, passed things, not from professional staff and lawyers in Washington. And then we made this fundamental mistake of thinking that all we had to do was sort of move to Washington and implement the agenda. And you fail the minute you realize that the power is outside of the Capitol, outside of every state capital, certainly outside of the nation's capital. We have let our base wither, and at the exact same time, the right wing in 1970s takes up, right, Business Roundtable, Phyllis Schlafly. You look at the reverse. The right wing in America begins to realize, it's the base, stupid, and they begin to build this hugely powerful base.
Yeah. What would you do, what would you have done in the last 12 months in Wisconsin, say, or in any other struggle you want to focus on? The concrete steps of how you do this differently.
Step one is having one-on-one conversations with every single rank and file member there is. And you say, well, how do you do that? People think, that would take a lot of staff. No, I'm not talking about staff. That's the thing. It's like, I'm talking about trusting workers, bringing them in, going through trainings, they go talk to everyone. Then they begin to systematically map every single relationship they have. What church are they in? What farmers do they know? So that the strategy of the work is not professional staff to other constituencies. It's rank and file members doing inventories with them, really tapping what are all the connections that the union member themselves has in their own community. And instead we sort of drop these layers of artificial coalition building like on top of the best source we have.
And what about what their lives are like? I mean, how much
Exactly.
does the workplace organizer know about what their members'
Exactly.
life is like outside?
Exactly, and very little. So one of the things that we do in the model of work, the way that I have had the pleasure of engaging the labor movement is, one is we start with these discussions. So we get through the election victory in the union, hard-fought fight. Now we're heading into a big first contract fight, and we know it's time to build serious allies. We're looking effectively to build and win neutrality, right? What the labor movement wants is like more fair rules, which they can boil down to the Employee Free Choice Act, which sounded like EFCA, like some social disease, but whatever. So, we give it bad names. But what we're trying to get to is how do we blunt the instrument of the employer? That's what all the tactical warfare labor's engaged in is. The odds are against us. The employers can fight like crazy. The model that I worked on and worked with for the last 15 years in the labor movement was that we said, screw labor law. Forget thinking we're changing labor law. Forget it. It's not happening in our lifetime. The odds aren't there. So how do we create neutrality on the ground? And we create neutrality on the ground by having the workers tap their own existing relationships to their own community, to go out themselves, not as I'm the union coming in to have a conversation about why we're so good, but it's Sally who goes to Reverend George's church, and Sally, very nervously by the way, and it takes about 4 rounds of work with Sally, because we've done this thousands and thousands of times. Workers aren't going to just go talk to their church leader, for example, their religious leader, of any kind. In fact, whenever I do trainings for union, people are like, they don't really want to do it, they're kind of scared of them. I'm like, note to self, labor movement, they're more scared of the house of faith in God than they are of you. So you have to do training work. You have to get the workers in role plays. They actually have to practice. But once they go and have that conversation, like you can see their shoulders change. When they go in and get support from their religious leader, it's like, well, God's on my side now.
It's kind of like the reverse of take your daughter to work day. Yeah. It's take your worker back home.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Where do you see it happening? Are there any models right now that are exciting to you?
Yeah, there's an experiment running up in Seattle with 1199 New England. It's one of the sort of progressive local within SEIU. And the places that I see it most consistently happening are on what we might call the margins of the formal labor movement, which is in a lot of the immigrant organizing, whether it's the domestic workers, whether it's Endelon, whether it's the guest workers, the fight we're seeing now in Louisiana, around the shrimp house. So there are places where it's happening. But the big problem is, again, going back to the piece that Bill Fletcher and I wrote on Wisconsin, is these tactics, or strategies really, not tactics, not games, these strategies are not being embraced by mainline labor.
On the election, talk about divide and rule. This is a period in which we go into what side are you on a very simple basis, on a very simple level. What's your advice to union organizers heading into this 2012 election?
I think we're in that normal awful situation that we're in this country, which is, of course, we've got to get Obama elected. It's not funny. I find it actually not funny to think about what the alternative is. However, pause. If we do anything during the election period from now to November, it's got to be that everything we're doing is additive. It's building towards getting ready to launch serious fights the minute the election is over. And I don't care if it's Obama, and I certainly care if it's Romney, it's going to be a different kind of fight. But either way, we have to be doing additive work. When we're out building a base for an election, too much of it is tactile. We want one vote out of them. We want to drive them out on election day. If we're organizers, it's how are we building for the long haul? How can we not make the same mistake this December of in 2012, that we made in December of 2008, which was to be gloves off, access is cool, we're back in the White House. That didn't get us very much in 4 years. So Democrat or Republican, we need to hopefully get Obama in, and then we need to fight like hell to get an agenda through that's not two-tiering Social Security, that's not two-tiering any benefits in this country. But fighting the next administration, whoever they are, is what we have to be building towards in the election period.
Jane McAlevey is, among other things, the author of the forthcoming Raising Expectations, Raising Hell, that we'll talk to her about when it comes out from Verso.